Hi, friend.
Hi, friend.
And to the brave hearts listening out there, welcome to Permission to be Human. I'm Andrea.
And I'm Janelle.
Get ready for some real-time relationship woo and wisdom
from the front lines with occasional tantrums and tears
about how breaking rules, blurring boundaries, and tossing tradition can be catalysts for finding your truth.
Let's debunk the fairy tales we were told as children and create a new map for life.
Yes, Disney can go fuck itself.
If you're seeking permission to choose your own path,
freedom is the new F word, people,
and want to feel less alone along the way,
we got you. Please note, this is our side of the story. Our partners and metamours have their own individual experiences, and we do not speak for them.
Hello, friend. Hey, Andrea. Hi, Bravehearts. We're excited to be back for another episode, another Braveheart Conversation recap episode.
Yeah, it's true. More juicy conversation. So much of it.
Yeah. This is our sixth one. And for those of you who watch our reels or who watch our YouTube, you're going to notice craziness that Andrea and I are on opposite chairs today.
I know. Although I don't know if you'll notice, but I have a totally new perspective on life.
Yes.
I'm sitting on the other side of the room.
Sometimes it's all it takes, Bravehearts, is just mix up one thing. Yes. A little thing.
It's very true. Okay, so this was a Braveheart Conversation, as we always have here at the Goddess Temple, with inquiry and insight. Mm-hmm. So today we're going to be talking about grief processing. Mm-hmm. Curious if intimacy is linked to purpose.
Mm-hmm. Well, if focusing on ourselves makes us a bad wife or partner.
Mm-hmm. If we have some wounds around the masculine, how do we address those when entering a new partnership?
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I would say also just how do we go deep into ourselves and not get too lonely?
Beautiful.
Mm-hmm. It's a tough one.
Yeah. So we're going to dive in. So the first question, how do I reconnect with myself? Be brave in choosing myself. Does that make me a bad wife or partner? And it's really lonely when I'm reconnecting. I just feel like crying, and it's not pleasant.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I really have so much compassion. I was just like, oh, I totally feel you. I get it. Like, it does not make you a bad wife or partner to be going inside. But it's new. It's unfamiliar. And it's not always encouraged by our culture to do that. So, but I do think that when we show up for ourselves, even in small little bits, just like sort of like flexing a muscle, then we can become more present for our partner, for the people in our life, for our children. And I've definitely experienced the reward of that, but the pain initially in going inward. Mm-hmm. And the loneliness, for sure. Like, it is so lonely. And I can actually, it's a testament though, I can actually tell you that I used to go in and be lonely. And now I go in and my mind is still like, oh, you should be lonely here. You should be lonely here. You're lonely. Definitely lonely. Don't think you're going to get out of getting lonely. Mm-hmm. But when I check in with my body, I'm like, oh, nope, not lonely. Just glad to be with myself. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's a weird feeling, but it has taken years, actually, of practice to get there.
Yeah. Yeah, and I've been a witness to the journey.
Yeah, totally. Painful.
Yes. And I agree. Choosing ourselves is perceived by others and ourselves potentially as being selfish. And I actually consider it the opposite. I call it, when we reconnect with ourselves, I call it investing in our radiance. Mm-hmm. But it can be really uncomfortable, as you just mentioned, right? There's so much to unlearn. And then when we unlearn something, just as like what you just said, like when we unlearn that, oh, we're not lonely, then the nourishment that comes from being with ourselves and the enjoyment and the pleasure that comes from that state also can be uncomfortable until we get used to it. Like, it's like, oh, it's uncomfortable feeling good as well until we've increased our capacity for that pleasure.
Such a bitch. Yeah, I've been through this a couple times with people recently. I'm like, oh, You're doing good. How does it feel? They're like, it feels like shit.
Yeah.
It feels awful.
Yeah. But I would say that's actually a really great sign that it's working.
Yeah. I agree.
There was,
right.
I saw there's a beautiful like TikTok meme or something where a woman had a jar of water or a jar and put a bunch of ping pong balls in it. And she said, okay, now you're reconnecting with yourself, to use this question, and poured water in. And then all these ping pongs started to rise to the top. Yeah. And she's like, this is all the stuck energy, the emotions that are uncomfortable and unpleasant. And they're going to start to bubble to the surface because they've been at the surface, underneath the surface for so long. So you're going to like reconnect with yourself, do self-worth, do all this work, personal growth, pour more water in, and then more bubbles are going to come up, and more ping pongs rather are going to come up. And it's going to be uncomfortable and it's painful because you can feel them and you don't want to feel them. But if you pour more water in, eventually the ping pongs fall out. And then what you're left with is just a jar of clear water.
It's pretty good.
It was really good.
I like it.
Yes.
Yeah.
So the journey, I think if we were to think of, it shouldn't hurt, it shouldn't be painful, then ultimately what we're doing is bypassing. And that's actually not the solution either.
Yeah, spiritual bypass.
Yes.
I remember first learning about that.
But so it takes a lot of patience and practice to move through.
Yeah, for sure. So Liz Gilbert, the Eat, Pray, Love lady who I'm quoting all the time, I just finally listened to the rest of her interview with Tim Ferriss. And just continual gems in there. So she says, whatever we do deeply, we do lonely. Do you agree with that? I don't know if I do.
Yeah, I don't know that I do. I feel like there is what what resonates is if I'm going in deep. It's an internal, like, this is the motivation is of my being, of my heart, my knowing. And so if I want someone to meet me there who's not meeting me there, then that would be a very lonely thing. But that chances are, well, it depends. And it depends if it's an external or internal quest, right? Like a writer is probably very going deep. It's an internal process, right? That it might be a very lonely one because it's a dialogue with yourself. But you and I just spoke about this, right? I went really deep into salsa dancing, and for like 3 years, and that was an activity. I developed a couple of good friends from that, but it wasn't about the friendship. It was about me connecting with myself, but I was able to do it in community.
I think that when I think about doing things deeply, I just feel like the deepest thing is when I'm alone. I just feel like, while I can do something deep with a partner or with a friend, like, because there's only maybe one body to go into with me, it's like, no, I can excavate even more. I can be alone. It's just me. I don't have to manage someone else's nervous system, manage someone else's like past wounds, baggage, any of that shit, right? It's just a little simpler, right?
Right.
So therefore it's a little more focused. And so I think about doing things deeply. I'm just like, when I'm doing things deeply, I'm doing them just me. And I think it can get lonely. It doesn't have to, though. I would say it, not necessarily, but that it has been my experience that when I have gone the deepest in myself, I am not with anyone else.
Oh, and I think what I'm hearing with that is that I answered the question differently. Like, am I going deeply into a project? But if the project is me,
right,
then I 100% agree. Like I can be interacting with people who I love and I can be connecting with on a deep level. Yeah. But then I almost have to come back to being alone so I can integrate that experience to understand and process it for myself.
Yeah.
But I would say the more I connect with myself, like the less lonely I feel.
Yes. No, I agree. And I think that's what I've experienced, what I mentioned in the beginning of this question was like, oh, I'm comfortable there now.
Right. But I used to be very afraid of it. Especially when I was afraid of being alone.
Totally.
it was like, oh my gosh. Yeah. So I'm recognizing the transition. I used to go out and socialize 7 nights a week when I was single and lived alone. I would socialize all the time because I didn't want to spend a night alone. And now it's like just covet it.
Yeah, I know. Me too. And it is really an interesting, it's a fascinating change. Like sometimes you have to go deep to hear the whispers, to listen to spirit, to hear God, right? And because you can only get that quiet when you go that deep. And recently too, I've learned that I don't have to be in a certain place to go deep. I just have to make the space myself. So even if I'm on my porch and not like in the middle of the forest, I have to metaphorically create space around me that allows me to go deep. And that might mean setting my phone down. It might mean not answering a call from someone I know, or not paying attention to what's happening in my neighborhood, not following a dog down the street with my eyes. Like so many things have to be blocked out to create that space. And it's a challenge. It's a challenge in our world. And so it takes real commitment to go that deep and listen that much. So the same person said, in addition, I believe that my husband only knows me in this post-trauma state because he met me after I lost, in a very short sequence, my brother, my dad, and my uncle, all important masculine figures in my life. I think I've been in grief for many years. What if he has resistance to the real me?
Yeah. First, I just like feel, right? I feel the grief of what she's experienced in her life, right? And her being able to name that and acknowledge that.
Yeah.
And acknowledging also that it's unprocessed grief. In our culture, we are so grief phobic, death phobic. And yet the way that I really see grief and joy is, two sides of the same coin. That the more we can feel our grief, then the more joy we can feel. And that allowing ourselves to like go into the grief and to feel it and to process it. And so my question for her is, has she allowed herself to process the grief? Like I get that she's questioning the relationship with her husband, but is her husband going to like her
take a step back?
Yeah. It's like, okay, what's her relationship with her grief? And how can she make sure that she's processed it for herself, for her own well-being? And then from that place, like think about her relationship with her husband. But it feels like the loss of all of those men is such a huge weight inside her. And so if she can allow herself to move through it, then who would she be if she didn't have that weight is for her to discover. And so then the question is, how do you move through the grief, right? And not that there's any one way. There's an emotional release tool where you're just allowing energy to move through. There's also seeking grief therapy. There's grief rituals. There's actually community. I actually heard about a grief dance that a friend of mine is putting on. Like grieving in community can be a way to move through things. And so, but it's, again, this is a Braveheart action because we're so accustomed to denying grief that to think, oh, I'm going to seek support for my grief takes courage.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I just want to say a little bit about the grief in that also what happens that I've experienced with grief is that it's much easier to just, even though I'm so sad, like, and I'm experiencing that sadness and I'm sad and I think, oh, I'm processing the grief. What I was really doing a lot of that time was feeling sad and then putting on top of it anxiety and busyness, over and over. And I wasn't actually processing the grief. I was anxious about what I wasn't getting done because I was sad, because I wasn't doing enough work. And then I remember thinking, someone told me, like, be careful that you're not being so anxious that you're not actually processing the grief. And so it's just, especially like you said in our culture, where they're not really wanting. What I'm also noticed about processing grief is that, so often like people want, I've committed this myself. Like, no, I want you to process grief this particular way. Yes. Right? I'm trying to help someone. I'm like, you need to process this grief. And Nope, they're not processing it like I am. Most of my family does not process grief in the same way I do.
Oh my gosh, that's so true. That's so true. And so, Damasa, who we've had on this podcast before, she's a ritualist and actually specializes in grief and does grief rituals, and is on her Instagram, she's showcasing how some people think, oh, if I'm in grief, it's supposed to look. I'm just crying all the time.
Yeah.
And she's like, no, you can actually also be laughing and dancing in 1 minute. And then the next minute you're crying.
Yes.
And the next minute you're laughing. Right. And the next minute you're crying and can't get out of bed. And then the next minute you're okay because the sun is shining. And so that there's this undulating wave of emotions. Like grief isn't just one thing that looks stuck and stagnant or a certain way the whole time.
Yeah. And it also, just like we talk about being external processors, some people are internal processors. Some people are going to process the grief 3 months after. Some people are going to process the grief immediately. I have a friend who literally did not process the grief of her husband's death for a year. Like she was kind of stuck in a sense in a PTSD state.
Right.
And
then, no judgment on that. That just sometimes what
no, she just so she had to go through it. Like, you know, she was seeing therapists, she was doing all she could, but like it wasn't ready yet. It wasn't ready to come out. So,
and it is in that way coming out. Like grief is of the body, right? It's such a somatic experience.
Yeah.
And so our tendency when we suppress it means that we're kind of like closing it in, like pushing it down and closing the door. And so remember, like somatic exercises. If you were going to see a therapist, I would see like a somatic therapist, someone who's going to like have you do movement.
Absolutely.
So all that to say, right? Who you are in this very moment sounds like there's a discovery of a new, I'm not gonna say new version, but in this question,
a different version,
that before wondering, can this person, my husband, relate to you, right? Can you discover who you are?
Yeah.
Through this.
And I remember, so we chatted a little bit more with this person, and who's really also getting into the idea of like, do you have resistance to the real you? Right? Like, can you be accepting of the real you before you think about your husband? Like, you know, how can you look at this different you and discover with compassion, without judgment, with acceptance? Because it will be something different. You know, you're accustomed to living in this kind of post-grief state or grief state. And that's looked very familiar to you. It's very easy. You know it well. And this is going to look different. And that's going to be hard.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Such a good question.
Yeah, really, really just a beautiful exchange we had there at the Braveheart Conversation.
Next question is, in excavating a deep male wound, a pattern has woven fear and anger towards them. As I prepare to be open in a conscious partnership, how do I reprogram my subconscious patterning? I've read plenty about the divine masculine, and it feels like more of a Disney fairy tale. I think acknowledging, right, that you're recognizing the subconscious patterning around the masculine.
Yeah.
I mean, we did an episode on here called Trigger Warning, Janelle's journey from feminist to feminine.
That's
and
right.
Really having to navigate what ultimately was a projection on to the masculine outside of myself, was me really coming into relationship with the feminine inside of me. Like it's an interesting paradox. So I recommend reading Alison Armstrong, The Queen's Code and the Keys to the Kingdom, which she provides like a women's perspective on the male psyche. And that book really helped me see my subconscious patterning, but not the first time I read it.
Yeah, I was gonna say like it. Yeah, I read most of it, and I would say it just was also like there would be a trigger warning on that for me. That was not. It was very fairy tale-ish, and I didn't like it. And I could see what was good, but there was a little too much narrative, too much sappy narrative to wade through to get to that.
Yeah, so the first time I read it, like I would say it just like went over my head. It didn't land. And then I read it again after I read Keys to the Kingdom. And it really, what I found with that book, I can see what you're talking about with like the fairy tale. It is written. I mean, it is actually written intentionally as such.
Correct. Yeah.
But I love how Alison Armstrong really calls me out as the reader on my own behaviors and assumptions, and has me question them, and then has me look at them in real life. It's not like she's saying, just believe me. Like the exercises at the end of the book are like, you have an art at the end of each chapter, give you an opportunity to see, oh, is this true in my life? How am I showing up in relation to this? And so in that way, I was testing for myself this hypothesis about these quote unquote traditional male values, these characteristics of the masculine.
Yes, agreed.
That I had been in resistance to because of my conditioning of like what I really ultimately what it comes down to is wanting the masculine to be more like the feminine. Instead of acknowledging it, it's actually two different things. And when is each one useful, if you will, like in any given moment? And that's then goes into the internal state of like, I believe that we each have the masculine and the feminine within us. And a big part of my journey at one point years ago, as someone who had led with her masculine for most of my life, to come to the part of my journey where I was like, oh, I actually trust my feminine. And when I started to trust my own feminine, I was able to, I already trusted and respected my own masculine.
Right.
But then that internal dialogue then I started putting that outside of me.
Yeah. So I think you need to explain more, in the last, I feel like we probably lost listeners in that last paragraph. Okay.
So we can take it out.
I don't know what, I really like it though, but I think you just have to go deeper. I think a lot of people, I'm not sure how, and I don't know how to remedy it because.
So I'm going to put this here, because maybe we'll take it out and we'll see.
Yeah.
So, the book also showed me, so the Queen's Code also showed me all the ways I did not honor men in my life. And how I didn't like the feeling of not being honored, but then saw how I was not honoring.
Yeah, and I would agree that the book, if you can get past kind of the way it's told, it's just, it is in the beginning, it's hard to buy. You're just like, yeah, I've heard all this. Like, I don't, like, if there's anger at the masculine or if there's some sort of resistance, you have to work to overcome it.
Yeah.
So the book, I just feel like the book didn't really help me do that. I had to fight to get, even though I think the messages are true and good, I think I would have preferred if there was out there something that acknowledges, or that, at least in my memory of reading the book, in the beginning, like, we get it. Like, here's what you've been spoon-fed. Here's what you've been told. For some reason, I can still remember reading it, even in Costa Rica, and thinking like, oh my God, I just want to throw up. Like, it was really just didn't sit well with me. And I also think there's great things in it, because like you, I did take a couple of those things and those practices or exercises and think, oh yeah, it's true. Like, I'm resistant to looking at my own prejudice of the masculine.
And I think that's ultimately, there's plenty of other books I can give you, especially ones about David Data, that are harder to digest in a way, because this is actually still written from the female perspective. True. Reading books about the divine masculine from the male perspective there's a lot of like, I was like, because
interesting. That's a good point.
Like, I do believe it is our work as women to navigate this. If we want to be in a healthy relationship with a man, then we have to look at ourselves and do the hard, deep work with ourselves about it's coming back to what I was saying earlier, that I believe all of us have this like masculine and feminine like dynamic between us.
Yeah.
And that until that actually heals, then our relationships outside of us, like our partnerships and our conscious partnerships, we're still going to be challenged.
Yeah. Yeah, it's totally true for me. Yeah. I defined my feminine through someone else and then go find my feminine on my own.
Mm-hmm.
And then could understand how I could repair the dynamic of the feminine and masculine in my marriage.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Beautifully said. And I think so fucking painful, right? Yeah. I mean, I remember, it's like this. It's like gears turning. They're rusted. And it was like, oh.
That is true.
Of me before I got to the point where I was like, oh, that's my feminine? I'm leading with my feminine? Whoa.
Oh my God. So hard. So, I mean, in summary, like with this, going back to this question, you know, we were saying like, okay, let's not judge your own feelings. Let's not force yourself to be reprogrammed in any way. Mm-hmm. We always fear what we don't understand. And so try to understand and let's dig in, inquire, and be curious about your own feminine and masculine. Mm-hmm. And then creating the intimacy with that then makes it easier to create the intimacy with the masculine and feminine in someone else.
Yeah. So, yeah. Beautiful.
Yeah.
So I'm going to add like another twist to this and just go a little bit even deeper. Is where I'm at on my journey now is that I have deep respect for the masculine. Mm-hmm. It does not mean that every single man I respect, and that there are, as much as I respect all the men who are in my life, right? It doesn't mean that I would be in conscious partnership and in surrender with every single one of them. That there are levels, like as in this question here, and she's saying she's preparing herself to be in conscious partnership, that requires to be very discerning of who you're choosing to be in conscious partnership with. And not because you're putting them on a pedestal. It's because you are saying you're really clear on your own boundaries, your own desires, your own wants, and then being able to discern who can help meet you there. And that for me, right, is like, oh, like I'm single in this moment. I don't know when that a person is going to come in who's going to meet me at that level. Yeah. But I'm really clear now that like, oh, not every man they can be beautifully masculine men. Not every man is going to deserve all of me, and it's up to me to decide who does.
Mm-hmm. So the next question was, are intimacy and purpose closely linked? When I get very close to my partner, there is a small little piece of me that I keep hidden. Is this okay? Because I feel like if I didn't hide it, I would get closer and have a better connection with my partner.
Does she want to keep it hidden? Or is she wanting to get closer to her partner?
No, she wants to get closer to her partner. But she's keeping this little piece of foil, actually. She just calls this little like tinfoil piece to herself. And she wishes she could completely surrender and open up completely. And that would create a better connection with her partner. But she doesn't want to. She doesn't want to surrender it.
So questions that come up for me, for this person, right? Yeah. Because it's always, I think it's really good to understand shared definitions, right? What does she imagine it would look like if that piece of foil was not there? What expectation does she have with herself? Like, what's the feeling of that? And then what if she let go of form? Does she have a sense of what that foil has to do with?
Yeah, my sense is just that she's like, well, I just want to keep a little piece of me just for me. And she struggles with the sort of selfishness of that. She didn't use the word selfish. She just felt like she shouldn't keep it all to herself. And so, but she wants to be closer to her partner.
But so maybe I misunderstood this. Is this in intimacy, like when they're having sex, or like in their life?
I think it's probably both. We discussed like the meaning, like what's intimacy with yourself look like? Mm-hmm. What does intimacy with your husband look like? Mm-hmm. And can you do both at the same time? And I think, of course, you can.
Right.
But I think that's what she wants. And, I just questioned, like, what if there's nothing wrong with keeping a little bit for yourself? Like, that's okay. Like, it seems like there's a judgment that she's not supposed to do that.
Right. I'm hearing that. And also, this is reminding me of your right? Does she think that they're supposed to be an A? Like, a relationship is supposed to be in an A and she's actually in an H and is judging herself for being in an H?
I think she's, so just to review Braveheart's, like, I've talked about before about the A versus the H. When you're the A, there's 2 swing set poles and they're melded together at the top and it's closed and you're connected in the middle. If one falls, the other one does too. In an H, you're both on independent individual paths, connected in the middle, building new rungs of connection as you go. And
these are 2, like, this is how Andrea describes like a relationship format style.
Yeah, this is something that my husband and I thought of early on, heard about, and thought, we want to be an H instead of an A. Because we had seen a lot of marriages really in a more A style. However, I don't think that she's an H and wants to be an A. I think that she wants to have more satisfying intimacy in a sexual and truly intimate in bed realm.
Okay.
She wants to be closer, right? But she's like, there's something that's keeping her from like, I can't totally be myself.
Got it. Oh my gosh, I have so many questions.
I know. It's too late. I know, which, we discussed a bunch of other stuff too. But,
yeah. What makes me come up with is, Omar Pani calls it the 7 chakra relationship, where are you connecting at all of the levels? Are you connecting at your root chakra, at your sacral, at your heart, at your throat, mind, and crown? And so and this is just now, I don't know, projection, but is she keeping, for example, part of her heart closed, right? But are there other areas that she's not connecting or connecting on, right? Like
that's a good question.
There's
Yeah, I can see some curious about that, right? There's some things that are connecting all the way and other things that are, but would you say though that, can't she keep the intimacy with herself and still be completely connected to her partner?
The words that are being used right now are what I don't want to say yes to that, because that word intimacy to me is not clear, because the question seems to be she is unsatisfied and unfulfilled with the sex with her husband because there's a part of her that she's keeping back. And so if she was fulfilled holding it back, I would say then yes, of course. But what I'm hearing is that she's unfulfilled. Now, if she's unfulfilled because she's supposed to be unfulfilled, and like if it's not actually a true, she's saying she's unfulfilled, but she actually is fulfilled, right? Then
I see.
Then there's something there. But it's now I'm armchair.
Yeah, I know. We don't know enough.
But what I will say is that putting yourself first in the way that like we've discussed, right? We use it in the context of solo poly, but
for sure.
But in the context of like, if I'm taking care of myself first, I know my needs, I know my desires, I'm asking for them. Yeah. And then from there being able to be met, then I am holding my independence and my sovereignty and my agency and being able to go very deep and vulnerably and transparently in relationship. Yeah. So that I think is possible.
Great. Okay. Cool. That's all we got.
Okay. Thanks, Bravehearts, for listening. We hope that you too will one day join us at a Braveheart Conversation, either in person or online. And hope we gave you something to think about today.
We always get into the good stuff.
Do you need permission to be human? You got it. Listen, subscribe, and review on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Learn more about us at permissiontobehuman.live.